I've owned my farm for over a decade. It's quiet, remote, and clearly marked as private property. Long gravel roads, fenced boundaries, no trespassing, signs every few hundred feet, everything is there for a reason. I live out here because I value peace, hard work, and the right to be left alone. That's why what happened that weekend still feels unreal. It started on a Friday afternoon. I was repairing a fence line near the east field when I noticed dust clouds rising in the distance. At first, I thought it was cattle trucks or maybe a neighbor passing through. But then I heard music. Loud music. Not country radio, party music. That's when I knew something was wrong. By the time I drove closer, my jaw dropped. At least 20 tents were already set up on my lower pasture. Cars, RVs, portable grills, folding chairs, an entire campsite had appeared out of nowhere. People were laughing, drinking, acting like they owned the place. My place. I parked my truck and stepped out, trying to stay calm. I asked who was in charge. A woman in her 40s walked up, clipboard in hand, wearing an HOA badge like it gave her authority everywhere on earth. She told me they were from a nearby subdivision and had decided to use the open land for a weekend retreat. I told her this wasn't open land. It was my private farm. She laughed. Actually laughed. Then she said something I'll never forget. Well, no one was using it. I pointed out the fences. The signs. The fact that I was standing there telling her to leave. She waved it off and said they'd already settled in, permits or not, and that I could file a complaint with the HOA if I had an issue. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with reasonable people. I warned them politely, once. I told them they were trespassing and needed to leave immediately. I even offered to give them an hour to pack up. The response? Eye rolls, smirks. One guy told me to relax and enjoy the weekend. So I left. Not because I gave up, but because I needed to think. I went back to the main barn and sat there watching the sun go down. The music got louder. Fires were lit. ATVs started tearing up my pasture. That land feeds my livestock. It's my livelihood. And these people were treating it like a free campground. I considered calling the sheriff, but I knew how slow that could be on a Friday night. And honestly, part of me wanted them to learn a lesson they'd never forget, one that didn't involve paperwork. That's when I looked over at the manure tanker parked beside the barn. Every farmer knows that tank. It's not dangerous, not illegal, but it's unforgettable. By full dark, I climbed into the tractor and hooked it up. The engine roared to life, low and steady. I drove slowly toward the lower pasture, lights off until the last moment. The reaction was instant. People started yelling, scrambling, shining flashlights. I didn't aim at anyone. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply drove laps around the campsite, doing what that tanker was designed to do, on my land. The smell hit them first. Panic followed. Tents collapsed. People ran. Someone screamed about ruined equipment. Another shouted that they were calling the police. I kept driving. Calm. Methodical. Every pass made the message clearer. This wasn't a campground. This wasn't public land. And I wasn't asking any more. By midnight, half the camp was gone. Cars sped out, tires spinning in the mud. By 3 a.m., only a few stubborn holdouts remained, sitting in their vehicles, windows rolled up, engines running. At dawn, the pasture was empty. They left behind trash, broken tents, and absolute silence. Later that morning, the sheriff finally showed up, called by the HOA woman herself. I showed him my property lines, my signs, and the damage they'd done. He didn't even write me a warning. He just shook his head and said, "Some people need to learn the hard way." The HOA never came back. They never contacted me again. And my farm has been peaceful ever since. Because respect isn't optional, and private property isn't a suggestion. After I left the campsite that evening, I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt disappointed. Disappointed that grown adults, many of them homeowners who constantly talk about rules and order, could ignore basic respect for private property. I gave them a clear warning. I gave them time. They chose arrogance. Back at the farmhouse, I watched from a distance as their little weekend party grew louder. Music echoed across the fields. Fire pits burned. Laughter carried through the night air like they were celebrating a victory. To them, I was just some farmer they could brush aside. They didn't understand that farms don't run on entitlement, they run on boundaries. I tried one more peaceful option. I drove down again, parked at the edge of the pasture, and told them the sheriff would be involved if they didn't leave. That HOA woman stepped forward again, clipboard still in her hand like a shield. She told me they had community approval, and that I was overreacting. Someone behind her shouted that farmers always exaggerate. That was it. I turned around without another word. People often assume farmers are pushovers because we're quiet. In reality, we're patient. And patience runs out. I didn't want anyone hurt. I didn't want arrests or lawsuits. I wanted them gone, and I wanted the message to be clear enough that they'd never try something like this again. That's when I decided to respond my own way, using nothing but what I already had. The manure tanker had been filled earlier that day for scheduled field work. Everything about it was legal, normal, necessary. I checked the connections, climbed into the tractor, and let it idle while I took a breath. The night was calm, crickets chirped, stars overhead, a sharp contrast to the chaos down the hill. When I started driving, I didn't rush. I didn't charge in. I took the long path around the field, letting the engine noise announce my presence. When the headlights finally came on, the campsite froze. People stared. Some laughed nervously. Others immediately sensed something was wrong. I began circling the perimeter first. Slow, steady passes. The smell reached them almost instantly. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Someone gagged. Another yelled, "What the hell is that?" Panic spread faster than the odor. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. People started pulling tent stakes out of the ground in a hurry. Coolers were slammed shut. Folding chairs were tossed into truck beds. A few tried yelling at me, threatening lawsuits and police calls, but their confidence was gone. They knew they'd crossed a line. Every lap made it worse for them. The ground turned slick. Shoes sank into mud. Expensive camping gear was abandoned because saving it wasn't worth staying another minute. That weekend retreat dissolved into chaos. One man ran up waving his phone, screaming that he was recording everything. I waved back and kept driving. Record all you want. This was my land, my equipment, my right. By 1 a.m., the music was gone. By 2 a.m., more than half the vehicles had left. By 4 a.m., only a few cars remained, engines running, windows sealed tight as they waited for daylight, or courage. I stayed out there until the sun began to rise. As the sky turned orange, the last holdouts finally drove off, leaving deep tire ruts in a field full of trash. Silence returned. Real silence, the kind farms are meant to have. I parked the tractor, washed up, and started documenting everything. Photos, videos, damage to the pasture, broken fences, burn marks from fire pits. I knew what was coming next. Around mid-morning, the sheriff arrived. Calm, professional. He listened to their complaint first, then walked the land with me. I showed him property maps, posted signs, and the warning I'd given them. He took notes, nodded, and then did something unexpected. He laughed. Not loudly. Just enough to show he understood. He told me trespassing complaints against landowners almost never hold up, especially when the land is clearly marked and warnings were ignored. The HOA group was told to consider themselves lucky no citations were issued against them instead. A week later, I received an email from their HOA board threatening further action. I forwarded it to my lawyer. That was the last I ever heard from them. No lawsuits, no apologies, no return visits. But word spread. Nearby communities learned that my farm wasn't a free space to claim. Contractors asked permission before entering. Hunters stayed off my land. Even neighbors started double-checking boundaries. That night didn't just clear a campsite, it restored respect. Sometimes, the only way to deal with people who ignore rules is to remind them that rules still exist, even when they don't like them. I didn't break the law. I didn't hurt anyone. I simply used patience, timing, and a very effective reminder. They came looking for a weekend getaway. They left with a lesson they'll never forget. People who love rules often believe those rules exist only for others. I've seen it again and again, especially with HOAs. They regulate lawns, fences, paint colors, parking angles, every detail of daily life. But the moment those same people step outside their controlled neighborhoods, something strange happens. The rules vanish, respect disappears, and entitlement takes over. This story isn't about anger. It isn't about revenge. It's about boundaries, and what happens when people decide those boundaries don't apply to them. My farm sits just beyond an HOA-managed community. It's been in my family for years, long before the subdivision existed. When the neighborhood was built, property lines were surveyed carefully. Fences were installed. No trespassing, signs went up. There has never been confusion about where HOA land ends and my farm begins, unless someone chooses to ignore it. That choice is exactly what they made. It started with a quiet assumption on their part. They looked at my open fields and saw unused space. Not pasture. Not livelihood. Not private property. Just land they thought no one would miss for a weekend. They planned what they called a community outdoor retreat. Instead of renting a campground or asking permission, they simply crossed the boundary and started setting up. Tents appeared. Trucks rolled in. Fire pits were dug. Music played. All without a single conversation with me. By the time I noticed, the damage had already begun. I approached calmly. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I explained, clearly, that this was private land and they needed to leave. I pointed to the fences. The signs. The survey stakes. The response I got was polite on the surface but dripping with dismissal. They told me it was just for one night. They told me I was making a big deal out of nothing. They told me the HOA had community approval. What they really meant was that they didn't believe I could stop them. That's the dangerous part of entitlement. It convinces people they're untouchable. I tried reasoning with them. I explained how livestock grazing works, how soil compaction damages fields, how fires and trash put animals at risk. None of it mattered. To them, I wasn't an owner, I was an inconvenience. That was the moment I realized words were useless. I walked away, not because I was intimidated, not because I was unsure, but because I understood something they didn't. Control doesn't come from yelling. It comes from patience and preparation. Everything I did afterward was legal. That matters. This wasn't chaos or impulse. It was deliberate, calm, and within my rights as a landowner. Farms don't shut down because someone feels entitled. Work continues. Equipment gets used. Land gets managed. And that night, my farm was operating exactly as it always does. The atmosphere changed quickly once they realized I wasn't bluffing. Laughter turned into confusion. Confidence turned into discomfort. Entitlement turned into panic. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The situation explained itself. People started scrambling. Tent stakes were yanked out of the ground. Chairs were tossed aside. Coolers were abandoned. Expensive gear suddenly wasn't worth staying another minute. A few tried to argue. Others threatened to call the police. Some pulled out their phones, recording furiously, convinced they were about to expose some injustice. They didn't understand something critical. Recording doesn't change reality. Reality was simple. They were trespassing. I had warned them, and I was operating on my own land. One by one, they left. Some left angry. Some left embarrassed. Some left silent. By early morning, the field was empty again. What remained was the aftermath: trampled grass, broken fencing, scattered trash, burn marks where fire pits had been dug without care. This was the part that confirmed I'd been right to stand firm. People who don't respect land don't clean up after themselves either. I documented everything: photos, videos, notes, dates, times. Facts don't need exaggeration. Later that morning, authorities arrived after receiving complaints from the HOA. I walked them through the property lines, showed them the signs, explained the warning I'd given, pointed out the damage. The conversation was short. There were no citations for me. There were no warnings. There was only acknowledgement. That's when the tone shifted completely. The HOA's confidence collapsed once they realized rules still existed beyond their neighborhood gates. Their threats of lawsuits turned into silence. Their emails stopped. Their meetings no longer mentioned my land. But the impact went further than that one group. Neighbors began acting differently. People slowed down near the boundary. Contractors asked permission before entering. Hunters stayed clear. Word spread that my farm wasn't open space, it was protected space. That's the real lesson here. Boundaries only work when they're enforced. Not emotionally, not violently, but consistently and correctly. I didn't win because I was aggressive. I didn't win because I humiliated anyone. I won because I stayed calm, stayed legal, and refused to surrender my rights. The land recovered. Grass grew back. Fences were repaired. Life returned to normal. And the HOA learned something they never expected to learn from someone they underestimated. Rules don't belong to organizations. They belong to reality. And reality doesn't care how entitled you feel.